Funding for this program is provided by the Bernard and Irene Schwartz Foundation, the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, and by Marilyn Ware.
My name is Ben Wattenberg. I've hosted a program on PBS for many years called Think Tank. I graduated from a small college in upstate New York and grew up in an all-Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx. I never dreamed that I would be a speechwriter for an American president, help run a presidential campaign, or be called any kind of a conservative. If you don't already know, I'm what they call a neoconservative, and I am annoyed that neocon has taken on such a negative connotation in recent years. I'd like to share my story with you and show you just what neocon means to me. This program is based on my new book, Fighting Words, A Tale of How Liberals Created Neoconservatism. Words have power. I grew up in New York City, the Bronx to be exact. These neighborhoods were a center of Yiddish culture, some Zionist, socialist thought with a particular emphasis on the union movement, and some out-and-out communism. These were a collection of small towns, not terribly different from the rest of America. This is PS 95, Public School 95. Everybody in the neighborhood went to the public school. We said the Pledge of Allegiance before it said under God, by the way. We learned all about American history. We learned a little European history. We learned how to speak English. The teachers were wonderful and dedicated, and everybody knew everybody. So many of the kids who grew up in those Shalom Aleichem houses and went to PS 95 and lived in the amalgamated housing and then went on to DeWitt Clinton High School, became famous scientists, Nobel Prize winners, famous engineers, famous politicians, famous actors. Burt Lancaster went to DeWitt Clinton High School. Patty Chayefsky, the terrific television playwright, came from this neighborhood. It was all public. It was taxpayer funded. People here worked hard. They paid their taxes. They believed in government, and government at that time was a good bargain. Like me, Joshua Moravchik grew up in the boroughs of New York. As a young man, he was an active democratic socialist. Now he's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
In this community of sort of the immigrant Jews, there was this portion of it that was highly politicized. Now, not all of it, and some of it continued to be religious and maybe made a more conventional integration into the American economy, went into business and became doctors and lawyers, but there was this highly politicized segment.
This is my sister, Rebecca Schull. She's a playwright and an actress, and she starred for 8 years in the sitcom Wings. She played Fay, the sort of ditzy stewardess. And this is where we grew up. This is called the Shalom Aleichem houses, a center of Yiddish culture globally, all Jewish. The idea that there would be a Christmas tree here is unbelievable.
Our parents had very good friends who in fact, the father grew up with my mother in Palestine. So they were very close. Two families were very close. The kids all played together. That family, not the father, but the mother, was an ardent communist.
And supported Stalin.
And supported Stalin, but when it came to the point of the Hitler-Stalin pact, I think, that's when mother stopped talking to them.
Communists argued with socialists who argued with Zionists. I didn't pay much attention and didn't really understand it, but politics colored everything here in the Bronx.
That was a period of the Great Depression when global capitalism looked like it had failed, and you had all of a sudden the growth of state intervention, the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, and a general apocalyptic sense that the old world based on markets and free market competition was coming to an end.
When they came to the New World, they were already imbued with a lot of revolutionary ideas that had been in the atmosphere, and they gave up all the old beliefs and they attached themselves to new beliefs. And even though these people thought of themselves as having been enlightened, they had broken away from religion because they were so much more scientific minded. But I don't think they were. I think that they treated particularly socialism, communism, as a new religion.
City College are the two words you need to know. Made famous by Irving Kristol, Irving Howe, Norman Birnbaum, and innumerable people. Very high level ideological disputation, at a very high level of language and irony and humor, by people whose parents probably had spoken Yiddish only, or Yiddish plus English, at a time of very, very, very acute political crisis and drama. Stalin, Trotsky, the rise of fascism, the war in Spain, the splits within the left, the New Deal, all of this. Everything seeming to count.
Everything did seem to count. And so in the late 1930s, New York politics invaded every aspect of our lives.
There was a family that lived in that building, and a son of theirs who was probably, 15 or 16 years old at the time, was killed in a car accident. And there was a service for him, and my mother went to the service, and the boy's mother got up and said, "I just wish he had been killed in the Spanish Civil War instead of
On the side of the left, obviously.
Yeah. And my mother came home. I remember she was so outraged by this, to take the opportunity of a kid being killed and to turn it into this kind of a political statement. I think she found it very terrible.
Well, I think she was right. September 1st, 1939, I was just 6 years old, changed the world. Hitler invaded Poland, bombed Warsaw, but no one at that time had any idea that something like the extermination camps and the Holocaust could take place. I mean, that had never happened before in history. And as it slowly revealed itself during the war years, it shaped everybody's politics, everybody's attitudes, everybody's way of life.
On this day of victory in Europe, I would ask you all to remember those of our comrades who fell in the struggle. They gave their lives that others might have freedom.
After World War II, Americans had hoped for peace and prosperity, but a nasty Cold War began. About this time, many of those Jewish kids left the Bronx and Brooklyn and took their left-wing politics with them. Some of those young people began to question the dogmas of their parents, and some became architects of what is now called neoconservatism. I know something about that because I was one of those kids. I left the city and attended Hobart College in Geneva, New York, and became a freelance writer. The fascination with politics instilled in me as a kid stuck with me through it all. In 1960, John F. Kennedy won the Democratic nomination for president. When attention turned to a running mate for JFK, one strong possibility was a senator from Washington State, Henry M. Jackson. He was called Scoop. He was an old-school liberal, a big government guy, and very tough on national defense. In the end, Kennedy chose Lyndon B. Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, who hailed from Texas. The Kennedy team wanted to shore up their Southern support. They did, Kennedy won, and they got some of those Southern electoral votes. Scoop Jackson ended up as the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. After the 1960 presidential election, I picked up a book called The Making of the President, 1960 by Theodore H. White. It stunned me. Teddy White took all the census data from 1960 and brought it to life. He told the story of America with numbers. White sparked in me an interest in data which became a lifelong passion. Now, in 1963, John Kennedy had been killed just as the war in Vietnam was heating up. Suddenly, the optimism of the early 1960s seemed to evaporate.
We began to come up with some social science findings that were very troubling. Things weren't going to be anywhere as easy as we thought. This is harder than we knew.
In 1965, with Dick Scammon, the director of the U.S. Census Bureau, I wrote a book called This USA. What Scammon and I found was not a crisis at all. Unemployment was down, incomes were up. Of course, America had problems, but for most Americans, life was going pretty well. And every sign suggested that their standard of living would continue to improve. For liberals, it was a time of great promise. Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. With the help of a Democratic majority in both houses, sweeping laws were passed aimed at ending poverty and racial injustice while providing many new benefits. His program was called the Great Society. Today, some of my fellow neocons disagree with me on the legacy of that Great Society.
There was serious doubt among intellectuals and a few politicians that were following what the Great Society attempted to do. I don't think there was suspicion among the average American.
James Q. Wilson was a liberal professor at Harvard University. He later became a leading skeptic of the government's ability to fix basic social problems.
Our concern was that the Great Society was based on the premise that the government could do anything. And my view, and the view of other people, was that whenever the government tries to do something, it faces the law of unintended consequences. Something goes wrong, and you have to sit down and think what can go wrong. Medicare is a good example. When it was passed, the sponsors of the bill said it would cost $8 billion a year. It now costs $350 billion a year because they neglected to realize that when people are offered free medical care, however deserving they are of getting it, they're going to consume a lot of it.
Mr. Johnson and Vice President Humphrey arrive for ceremonies that will make the Medicare bill a part of Social Security coverage. The new bill expands the 30-year-old Social Security program to provide hospital care, nursing home care, home nursing service, and outpatient treatment for those over 65.
The big government we have in the United States is almost entirely the creation of programs that most neocons at one point or another in their lives supported. You know, the biggest parts of government, besides defense, which they would increase spending on, are Social Security and Medicare and the core safety net programs. These programs have been successful.
E.J. Dionne often disagrees with neocons like Jim Wilson. He's a liberal columnist for the Washington Post and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution.
There's a great line that Ben Wattenberg wrote with Richard Scammon that I have always taken to heart, and I take it as a liberal line, not a conservative line. They wrote in a piece for Commentary in 1972 that a lot of liberals come to the American people and say, our programs have failed, let us continue. And I think that's a huge problem that liberals had. Liberals did not want to acknowledge how many successes they had. Americans will say a lot of critical things about government, but when it comes to concrete benefits, when it comes to government solving problems, Americans like the government to step in as long as they believe the government can be competent. Americans believe Medicare is, broadly speaking, a program that works.
The Johnson White House was under fire from the left and the right over issues like the war in Vietnam and race. Anti-war protests erupted on college campuses. Riots exploded in inner-city neighborhoods like Watts and Harlem.
Your president calls upon all of our people
to join in a determined program to maintain law and order. Riots, looting, and public disorder will just not be tolerated.
I was living in Stamford, Connecticut at the time, freelancing, writing a book up in my attic. And I hated staying home all day. I went out for some lunch, and I came back, and my son, who must have been 5 then, maybe he was in kindergarten or something, he said, "Dad, Mr. House called." And I said, "I don't know any Mr. House, Danny. Who is that?" "I don't know." And about 15 minutes later, it said, "Mr. Wattenberg." I said, "Yes, this is the White House calling." And I said, "Oh, I think I'll take that call." Hayes Redmond comes on the phone and says, "Bill Moyers would like you to come down to the White House to consider being a speechwriter." I came down. Moyers says, "Come on up, there's somebody I want you to meet." The president turns to me and he says, "I've been reading your book. It's very interesting." And he started telling me about what the job of a White House speechwriter was, which I hadn't even accepted. I didn't even know it was going to be offered to me. Moyers finally nudges me and says, "Tell the president what you told me down in the mess." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, everything coming out of here is about a crisis." I had written this book, it was about the census, and America was doing very, very well. So I said, "Why don't you, to use the words of the old song, accentuate the positive? You've got a lot to, you, the Kennedy administration, have a lot to be proud of."
The book you and Dick did was the first book that I had ever seen that put a human face on statistics. And the reason I was drawn to it and recommended your work to the president is because, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, it's the mark of a truly educated man to be deeply moved by statistics.
They increased the minimum Social Security payment, $50 a month to $100 a month. For probably 10 million Americans, it meant the difference between being able to live and not being able to live. That great society set the basis for ultimately civil rights, of course, was the big one, the environment, equal opportunity, feminism, and it brought America into the modern world. In 1968, President Johnson had decided that he had become as much of an issue as the war in Vietnam, so he chose not to run for re-election.
"I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president."
The Democratic Party was coming apart at the seams. It was all heading to a terrible crescendo at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago.
A federal official said the police were hitting with a vengeance and quite obviously with relish. The report concludes there is no doubt that police discipline broke during the melee. The police were in a state of excited anger, according to an assistant U.S. attorney. Witnesses reported that individual police attacked residents of the neighborhood and beat bus passengers as they got off to go home.
That there was going to be trouble at the Democratic Convention in 1968 was not a secret. It was rather publicly announced by the radical left, by Tom Hayden and others of his ilk.
In 1968, Patrick Buchanan was an advisor to Republican presidential hopeful Richard Nixon, who sent him to Chicago to monitor the Democratic Convention. Buchanan later became a friend of mine and a frequent debating partner.
I was in the Comrade Hilton Hotel in Chicago, as we called it. And I was on the 19th floor and looking out a window with Norman Mailer and Jose Torres, the boxer, who was the Republican watch post at the convention when the police came down, I think it was Balboa, and took off after the demonstrators, and you had what was called the police riot. We had ringside seats right there looking down from the 19th floor and watched basically the Democratic Party come apart in the streets of Chicago.
I've never seen anything as horrible in my whole life.
I was at the LBJ
ranch in the hill country of Texas. I had been asked by the president to come down and help write a speech to be delivered at the convention in Chicago, which I did with some assistance from Larry Levinson, who was Joe Califano's principal deputy. I wrote it. I thought it was a hell of a speech. It was never delivered because the Secret Service said that the violence was so extreme that they couldn't guarantee the president's safety, so he didn't go.
I have to tell you, it did feel like a year in which all systems of authority were crumbling.
The Democratic Party has blood on its hands. And because there's a struggle going on in the world today between young people and between those old menopausal men who run this country. And it's a struggle about what the future of this country is about.
With the country really divided over Vietnam, the Democratic Party divided, Kennedy shot, Dr. King shot, the riots at Columbia that year, the 100 riots in American cities and burning of Washington, all this sort of came to something of a climax in that Battle of Chicago. And I think the perception to the American people was this was a party that could not unite itself and certainly could not unite America. The truth is, by 1968, the American people concluded the Great Society had been a failure, that the war in Vietnam, the Democrats didn't know how to run a war or end a war, and that the new economics was also a failure.
While the Democrats fought among themselves, the Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who promised an honorable peace in Vietnam. He won the White House, but the war went on, and so did the war within the Democratic Party. In 1970, Scammon and I wrote another book, this one called The Real Majority. It was seen as a Democratic response to a book called The New Republican Majority, a very conservative book by Kevin Phillips, which looked at the growing support for Republicans in the South and the West. The Republicans were feeling very bullish about their future. Meanwhile, the New Left had this dream that the Democrats could win elections by appealing to college kids, blacks, and the angry poor. Scammon and I wanted to send a wake-up call to Democrats, and we did it again with numbers.
I can remember as a young leftist in the late 60s reading a report of the Scammon-Wattenberg analysis, and I think it was called The Real Majority, and having the sinking feeling that they must probably be right, that the largest number of people in America were not in fact black, or young, or working class, or rebelliously inclined, or anti-war, that in the end, the demographics of it favored something like the Great Society version of the Democratic consensus, or maybe something more conservative, as Richard Nixon was later to demonstrate.
We said that the economic issue, which had been preponderantly important from the time of Franklin Roosevelt and the Depression, was no longer the #1 issue in America. You can have a recession or excellent economic times, and if there's a high crime rate and people doing pernicious, dangerous drugs and promiscuous behavior and stuff on television that you wouldn't want anybody to see, and things taught in school that you feel ashamed of, if a candidate comes along and says, "You're not the only one who feels that way, I feel that way also," he's going to get a lot of votes.
I got The Real Majority just about as soon as it came out, and I would claim I have the most underlined copy of The Real Majority. That book was really important to me, and I struggle with it because there was part of me that knew I disagreed with Ben on certain things, but there was part of me that thought this analysis in some deep sense was right. The irony, as I also discovered years later, is that if I had a huge fascination with that book, there's another person I got to know in later years who had a huge fascination with that book, and his name was Pat Buchanan. And if you want to look at where Richard Nixon's strategy in 1972 came from, it was when Pat Buchanan read The Real Majority and said, hey, this guy Wattenberg says Democrats are in trouble if they lose on the social issue. If Nixon is smart, he's going to go after the social issue and pull all those Democrats over.
I worked up 2 long memoranda, both for the president who read them. One of them was the contents of the book, and the second was the political strategy that came out of it, because it reinforced exactly what we had been doing. And it was the basis of what we call the 7 Weeks War against the radical liberals. And we succeeded.
I could see the dangers of this, of a kind of elitist campus politics that drove working people away, and an indifference to problems like crime that could cause the Democrats a lot of trouble. But I think when you go back to the real majority and think about what it said, it didn't make you a racist to worry about crime. And in fact, in that period that Ben wrote the book, that we now know there was a real crime wave going on in the country. So some people use law and order as a racist slogan, but some people use law and order because they were really worried about crime.
In 1972, I worked to help Scoop Jackson win the Democratic Party nomination for the presidency. We failed. The New Left had captured control of the Democratic Party. Senator George McGovern was nominated to run against Richard Nixon. He may have been a war hero and a nice guy, but he was the candidate promoted by the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party. There were more than a few of us not satisfied with the party's new direction. At that time, I then helped start the Coalition for a Democratic Majority.
The Coalition for a Democratic Majority came out of a sense among the hawkish Democrats that they were losing ground in the party. And so they tried to imitate some of the organizational strategies of the liberals in the party.
We started meeting secretly in a little proletarian hideout in the Federal City Club, a rather elegant place at night, because we didn't want people to be able to blame a McGovern loss on these renegade Democrats. Nixon won in a landslide, and I became the co-chairman and then the first chairman of the Coalition for a Democratic Majority. The first executive director of CDM was Penn Kemble, a dynamic young man who would become an important player in American politics.
If you can imagine that Richard Nixon could win the presidency in a landslide, you had to know things were politically very crazy in this country.
McGovern's loss was a vindication for us at the Coalition for a Democratic Majority.
But a lot of people took lessons out of a 49 state defeat.
We hadn't changed. It was the debate that changed.
Midge Decter was among the early members of the neoconservative movement. She was an editor of Harper's Magazine and is now on the board of the Heritage Foundation. She's one of my dear friends.
The Coalition for a Democratic Majority was made up of people who supported Hubert Humphrey and people who supported Scoop Jackson. I thought this was a terrific idea, and I thought Ben was a terrific guy. And so we sat down and drew up a statement.
McGovern's line had been at the convention, "Come home, America."
From secrecy and deception in high places, come home, America. From military spending so wasteful that it weakens our nation, come home, America.
And our ad said, "Come home, Democrats." Jeane Kirkpatrick described it, it's not an organization, it's a state of mind.
CDM was, for many of those Democrats, their last effort to change the Democratic Party before they defected to Ronald Reagan in 1980.
We had decided early on not to be a membership organization, but to be an organization dedicated to trying to change the climate of opinion. And I think we were pretty successful.
They called us neoconservatives, and we thought it was very unfair because, first of all, we did not call ourselves that. Second of all, we said and we believed that we were the true liberals. They were some new kind of liberal. In effect, when they coined that term, what they were saying is, you people are not liberals at all. You still call yourselves liberals, but you don't deserve to be. We have taken over liberalism, and what you are is a new kind of conservative, hence the term neoconservative. And at first, for a few years, we howled in protest at this label being put on us. Eventually, we all sort of threw in the flag and started using the term ourselves.
Neoconservatism, as I saw it develop, started as a principally domestic set of issues, crime particularly. but it evolved into something that became very interested in international affairs.
The neoconservative movement was a transformation of radicals from Marxist thought to pro-American thought. It happened with Irving Kristol, with Seymour Martin Lipset, with Nathan Glazer. Later on, it happened with Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter. And these people became the core of a new intellectual movement in the country. And part of that movement was organized around the principle of seriously opposing communism.
In 1974, Nixon resigned in disgrace.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And Gerald Ford became president. Scoop Jackson again made his presence known on the world stage when he co-sponsored the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Scoop's legislation linked improved trade relations with the Soviet Union to Moscow's performance on emigration and human rights. It was an important step away from the prevailing policy of détente and became a key part of an emerging neoconservative approach to foreign policy.
The Jackson-Vanik Amendment underlined the basic moral problem of the Soviet Union, because this was a period where Henry Kissinger wanted to do a deal with the Soviet Union on the grounds that it was going to last forever and we had to learn to accommodate Soviet power and have arms control with them.
Senator Henry Jackson did see through Kissinger's realpolitik in a very important way. And in the amendment he co-sponsored with Senator Vanik on the small question of the simple matter of the rights of the Jews of the Soviet Union, came into direct confrontation with what Kissinger thought the world should be like. Kissinger would have sold every Jew in the Soviet Union just for a photo opportunity with a forgotten despot, Leonid Brezhnev.
What Jackson-Vanik did was say, well, no, this is a different kind of a system. It is highly illegitimate from the beginning, and in a sense, we're never going to get past the problem posed by Soviet power unless, and this is importing a more recent term back into history, but unless we have regime change in some sense.
We took it as our chore to educate the world as to what was going on. It was a very, very perilous moment. In 1976, I was back with Scoop Jackson working for the Democratic presidential nomination. He won some big early primaries, but eventually lost the nomination to Jimmy Carter. Now, Daniel Patrick Moynihan ran for the Democratic senatorial nomination in New York with the support of Scoop Jackson, and he won. Pat Moynihan was a liberal icon and one of the great intellectuals in American public life. He too was disillusioned by where the Democrats were headed. And when Pat Moynihan talked, serious people on the left and the center and the right listened. He was, in many ways, a true neocon.
The old traditional socialists in a journal called Dissent, who were under attack as being not left enough, suddenly started attacking us. It was decreed that people like Glazer and Moynihan and so forth were not liberals, we were neoconservatives. A fellow like Irving Kristol said, well, if you say so, I'm going to be so.
He's proud of it.
Pat Moynihan was one of my closest friends, and he and I talked endlessly about the question of how the country should move. His concern was the condition of the family. He rightly observed that broken families were contributing to the values problem. And his famous Moynihan report, issued in 1965, made that argument.
The slums are also filling up with a lower class people, unemployed, ill-educated, ill-housed, for whom the cycle of no jobs and bad education and bad housing just reproduces itself and takes its most poignant personal form in the great tragedy of the family lives of these men and women and of their children.
After Carter won the '76 election, and we had been wooed, CDM had been wooed by some of his principal foreign policy advisors, Sandy Berger, Tony Lake, and said, boy, we're all going to share in these important foreign policy appointments, which did not happen. One of our people, an attorney who had been one of the signatories to our ad, Peter Rosenblatt, was appointed ambassador to Micronesia, the little islands, where he actually did a very good job and solved a long, festering problem. But Moynihan, who had this wonderful way of expressing things, said, Micronesia, we didn't even get Macronesia. So we were shut out.
When Jimmy Carter was president, of course, he ignored us totally until it was coming close to election time, 1980, and someone in the White House must have said to him, you know, there are these other Democrats over here, and maybe you should meet with them. So there was this grand meeting in the White House, which was a total fiasco. We were told that we should be very nice to him, so we said we were so glad to see that he was beginning to change his attitude toward the Soviet Union. Well, he walked out. And when that meeting was over, Jean Kirkpatrick was there. We walked out of the White House, and there was the White House press corps standing out in the snow, actually. And she walked to the head of the group, walked straight up to them and said, I am supporting Ronald Reagan.
President Carter had given a speech, I think, out in Notre Dame University, where he said, we have to get rid of this inordinate fear of communism in America. And this really rattled the CDM people and a lot of other people. I mean, here the Soviet Union had, first of all, consolidated this huge landmass of independent peoples, the Ukrainians and the Kyrgyz and the Tajik, and then taken over all of Eastern Europe, and were spreading their wings in Cuba and elsewhere, trying to establish Soviet surrogate states. So we didn't think it was an inordinate fear of communism. We thought it was a big deal. It was the survival of liberty in the world.
This at a time when Jimmy Carter was saying we were exaggerating the Soviet threat and promising to talk to Soviet leaders to make them kind again.
I resigned from the Carter administration as Undersecretary of the Navy after 3 years, in part because of that frustration. I just didn't think things were going anywhere, and we weren't getting enough money to build the ships we needed to build, which was really my responsibility. So after 3 years, I just left and went back to private life, and I voted for Reagan in 1980.
I think the most important fact about Ronald Reagan is that he had been a Democrat. If you listen to his invocations of family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom in that great 1980 convention speech he gave, this was someone who never completely felt alienated from that Democratic past, who understood working class Democrats, because that's where he had come from.
President Ronald Reagan was many things. In some ways, I think he was a neocon. He was an optimist, and of course, Americans like an optimist. He said that more free enterprise and more respect for the law could help restore America's cities. He beat Mondale in a landslide in the 1984 presidential election.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
I think that Reagan, in the way he spoke, reassured a lot of Democrats that he really wasn't alien from their own traditional culture, that he spoke a certain traditional language that they identified with. But I always thought it was very interesting that the group Reagan Democrats were still called Democrats. Because they still were in some ways tied to that political culture.
Calling the Soviets an evil empire, I think that had an effect on the way the Soviets thought about us. That and other steps, such as his marvelous speech in Britain and Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall.
Neither Brezhnev nor Gorbachev could spend an hour with Ronald Reagan and come away thinking that the United States was headed by some crazy, aggressive guy who hated them. He obviously didn't. He treated them like decent human beings. It was their ideas and their system that he kept bearing down on, and his touch was just, I think, just about perfect on this.
A big part of my life in the neocon movement has been our involvement with think tanks. I even named my PBS series Think Tank. In 1978, I was invited to become associated with the American Enterprise Institute. It was here and at other think tanks around the country that ideas and political philosophies were debated and contested, fighting words, if you will, before becoming Democratic or Republican policy.
As the neoconservatives drifted right, they formed a kind of intellectual alliance with many of the National Review conservatives. And that's where you began to develop a larger conservative intellectual movement that found a home at places like the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation. But it was really a long project that started with Buckley in the 50s, went to the neoconservatives in the mid-60s, they drifted right, and it was only in the 70s that this right-of-center intellectual alliance really came together, preparing the way for the Reagan presidency. Brookings, where we're sitting, is sort of the granddaddy of think tanks. We go back to 1921, and a lot of people say the liberal Brookings Institution. Actually, it's a place full of very different points of view, and it started out much more conservative than it was. It became liberal because we had a bunch of liberal economists in the 60s and 70s, very much identified with the great growth period in the Kennedy years and Johnson years. I think the American Enterprise Institute was critical to the rise of Reaganism. And AEI had been kind of a small operation that began growing in the 1970s. And they were very shrewd about creating a broad coalition by bringing in moderate Democrats, people like Ben Wattenberg, people like Norm Ornstein, and sort of creating a kind of broader argument about politics.
Under the leadership of President Bill Baruti and later Chris Demuth, AEI attracted big conservative thinkers. And to prove that they cared more about ideas than ideologies, they brought in a number of Democrats, including neocons like Gene Kirkpatrick and me.
What I found interesting about AEI and about Baruti is his theory wasn't that because the press corps and the academy were off at one end of the spectrum, that the way to get balance was to create something off at the other end of the spectrum. The way to create balance was to create a marketplace, because he had a firm belief that in the free marketplace, his ideas would have credence. And so we would create a fair-minded place.
So these places became hothouses for conservative ideas. And I think that liberals, in a funny way, took a while to catch up to that.
I think that the war of ideas was probably the key to all of the big shifts in American politics in a way that a lot of politicians don't quite appreciate, because if there hadn't been analysis, research on the part of think tanks and people that really wanted to use information in a systematic way, that you couldn't have brought about the political revolution that happened. And this is a problem I think the Democrats still have, that in many respects the intellectual agenda from the 1980s on was set by the right, and they've been struggling vainly to try to come up with a different hold that would break that hammerlock.
I had given a speech to some corporate group down in one of those plush hotels in West Virginia, and President Clinton spoke later. And at dinner, he went around, he's a great politician, from table to table, shaking everybody's hand. And he said, "Hi, Ben, how are you?" I said, "Fine, Mr. President." And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a book." And he said, "Well, you know, I'd love to see it. What's it called?" And I said, "Values Matter Most." And he said, "You know, that's what I've been thinking." And 2 weeks later, I'm in San Diego giving a speech. There it is again. Mr. Wattenberg, the White House is calling. And I knew the game by then. I said, "Yeah, who?" "The president, Mr. Wattenberg." "Well, I think I'll take that call." And he talked with me for about almost an hour. "I like your book. We don't agree on everything. You're absolutely right. I've been behaving more like a prime minister than a president. I've let myself be pushed too far to the left." And we talked about a variety of issues for a long, long time. And I took notes. And then I called David Gergen, who had been is a good friend of mine, a former press secretary. I called Mike McCurry, who was Clinton's press secretary, and I said, "Listen, the president talked to me. He didn't say we're off the record. I'm going to do a column on that." And they said, "Fine." I did a column. It was a very fair, very objective column. And George Stephanopoulos had said, "Mr. President, this is going to get you in a lot of trouble." And he said, "No, it's not. I'm saying things there that said I was wrong, and we're going to do better the next time." And of course, he was right. The story was splashed on the front page of every newspaper in America. At this point in history, with our goals seemingly accomplished and some in the Clinton White House seeing it our way, many of us in the neocon movement thought our work was done.
But Hartz thought that the things that we had fought for had been mostly achieved. Most importantly, the victory in the Cold War.
The issues of the 1990s had to do with family values, social order. These were issues where there was actually not that much consensus within the neoconservative camp as to exactly where they stood. They knew where they stood with regard to the Soviet Union, but that was an issue that had ended.
Pat Buchanan has little affection for neocons. His magazine, The American Conservative, breaks American politics into three groups: liberals, conservatives, and neocons.
And one of my criticisms of the neoconservatives is not that they didn't help, but that the idea that they won the Cold War and it was their arrival there that was decisive, I think that's really nonsense. I think, Ronald Reagan was fortunate to be where he was, but I think he was virtually indispensable to bringing down the Soviet empire where he did. And they were supportive of him when he was strong, but they were not indispensable.
Most of the neocons had become so upset with Clinton and Gore, and particularly their foreign policy team, that we sort of held our noses and voted for Bush. And along comes 9/11. All of a sudden, people who had regarded themselves as conservatives, Dick Cheney, the president, Don Rumsfeld, started behaving like what is called neoconservatism.
Bush is converted to neoconservative. He didn't come here a neoconservative. Cheney's not a neoconservative. He's a Wyoming conservative who really is bought into this line, and Rumsfeld's a moderate Republican from Illinois. But not everybody who supports the war is a neoconservative.
And then people said the neocons captured George Bush's brain. You don't capture a president's brain quite that easily. I mean, he was driven by events. Events drive politics.
Saddam Hussein had declared war on us or his neighbors or on the region, I think 3 times at least. The invasion of Iran, the invasion of Kuwait, the attempt to physically erase the Kurdish minority of northern Iraq, the rocketing of Israel, the support of Abu Nidal's organization, a network of gangsterism around the region. That's quite a lot of initiatives against the civilized world. I thought it was high time we put an end to that. We put up with him for far too long.
On March 19, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began.
I think in addition to advocating the Iraq War, the other thing that defines the neocon position currently is believing in the war against terrorism, believing that there is a really serious threat out there. Norman Podhoretz and James Woolsey have both frequently used the term World War IV.
The Middle East is going to be a very hard case of a set of countries to see changes made, but I don't think we should give up on that.
Neocon today is people who believe that we are in such a war and that we must fight it to conclusion.
We made some very bad mistakes in the way we handled Iraq, but is it worth it ultimately for Al-Qaeda to be defeated in Iraq and for that part of the world to have a country that is beginning to establish a consensual rule and the rule of law and electoral democracy? I think it may well turn out that that will have a positive effect on that part of the world, and it will turn out to be, on balance, a positive decision in spite of the terrible mistakes that we made in the course of bringing about the current circumstances.
Francis Fukuyama was a leading neocon thinker, but in 2003, he broke ranks over the Iraq War.
My change of heart came about in the period between then and the opening of the Iraq War, because I started to think much more seriously about whether the United States, looking back at our own history, really had the fortitude and the political consensus to engage in a long-term occupation and struggle to reshape the politics of that region. And as we got closer to the war, it seemed to me that we were really not terribly well prepared, and that if we weren't going to prepare the American people for a long struggle, it probably was better not to get involved in the first place.
When the United States and its allies invaded Iraq and things got tough, cry went up abroad and at home to blame the neocons.
A lot of us look at the neoconservatives, look at this war, and say, you guys really let us down a terrible path, and it's going to take our country many, many years to recover from the mistake that you guys made.
I felt it would be a disaster, and I think it's turned out as a disaster. But that's where the neocons, where they succeeded, is they were well positioned in the administration. But more important than that, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Bush, who are the deciders, agreed with them. Or Bush, I think, came to agree with them. Maybe he agreed with them going in, but he hadn't sounded like it. And once they adopted this neoconservative agenda, and Bush started delivering these speeches, which are steeped in neoconservative ideology, Wilsonism on steroids, I think George Bush became the first neoconservative president.
I still think that if this is a victory, then like General Pierce once said, one more victory like that and we're done for.
I'm a member of that perhaps small group called Liberals for Wattenberg. There are a number of things that have always been fun about Ben. One is his absolute love for numbers, and that's what we've always shared in common. He taught you that there's nothing more interesting than a new census report. Now, who'd have thunk it? The other thing you gotta love about Ben is this insatiable optimism that he's had all his life. And whatever our political differences have been, I kind of share that sense of optimism about the United States in the long run.
That word that was originally used, we believe, by Alexis de Tocqueville when he wrote about democracy in America in 1832, the phrase was American exceptionalism. And I think that's one of the root phrases of what we call neoconservatism today, American exceptionalism. And it means that Americans are an exceptional people.
He loves arguing and he loves debating, and he's a good advocate for his cause.
Well, eventually neocon became a label that few people these days understand. So what in the end is a neocon? Is it a conservative Jewish kid from a radical Jewish New York neighborhood? Yes, except when it's not. A hawk on Iraq? Well, some are, some aren't. A conservative Republican gone soft? Maybe. A Democrat who's lost his heart? Sometimes. Now, Most neocons are not afraid of government programs as long as they work. We do believe that free markets work. We believe that some government regulations are flawed. We see a lot of immigration and say that unbalanced, that's probably good. We see people in the world embrace hate and violence and say, like most everyone else, that's not good. We see crime fall when enforcement goes up, and we know that's good. We see interest groups turn Americans against one another and say, well, that's not good. In the end, most neocons don't hate America, they don't hate patriotism, they don't hate free markets, and they don't hate law and order. We do think the world can become a better place. We think Scoop Jackson's slogan had it just about right. Common sense for a change.
Funding for this program is provided by the Bernard and Irene Schwartz Foundation, the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, and by Marilyn Ware.